Hi, my name is Firdoze Bulbulia. I am the chairperson of the Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa. I'm also the director of the Nelson Mandela Children's Film Festival, and I am an independent filmmaker producer from South Africa. I am here to celebrate children, particularly African children, and to talk a little bit about the representation of African children in the media. Article 4 of the Africa Charter on Children's Broadcasting says that children should hear, see, and express themselves, their languages, and their life's experiences through the electronic media that reaffirms their sense of self, community, and place. We tend to use this article very often as we talk to young people and to adults about quality media for African children. Our concern always is that children do not see themselves. As African children, they are inundated with content that comes mainly from the West, mainly European, and mainly white. How do we as storytellers, as filmmakers, as people working in the media, ensure that the images that our children are exposed to do indeed reflect them, their lives, and their life stories? As part of our work as the Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, we have worked since 1993 to ensure that children's voices and children's images are actually seen on television. South Africa only won its independence in 1994, so we are still a very young democracy. Next year marks 30 years of our independence and of our freedom. As part of the celebration, we will produce 100 10-minute sections on children and media and children and freedom in South Africa. What is very exciting for us is that the SABC, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, had imposed a wonderful production for children, and it ensured that education television really looked at quality education for all children. So from 1994 onwards, the South African broadcaster was almost informed and impacted by ensuring that all languages of South Africa would be heard on television and on radio. This meant that content had to be produced for children in their languages. It became a huge struggle for producers, especially since most of the producers were white in South Africa, and the content that they produced was really from a European and Western perspective. As the Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, we had to work at educating, informing, and even training some of these producers. And there was a funny time at one point where a young white producer said to me, well, if you say that children, particularly Black children in South Africa, do not have access to television, then why must we make films for them? Why must we produce content for them? If they can't see it, why should we produce it? You can hear from that already the challenges that we were having in our country. That even though South Africa is made up of 80% Black people, the 5 or 6% of white people ruled the content. They produced the content and they decided on what children would see. So as the Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, we knew that our work was cut out for us. We knew that we needed to train many of these producers. We needed to help them. We needed them to understand why it was important that they had to produce content that was for all children. And not only in terms of language, but also in terms of color, that they needed to ensure that the diversity of South African children would be seen on television. So we were talking about rural children, we were talking about poor children, we are talking about children with disabilities, so that all children will be reflected on television. And that when children actually see each other, they understand where other children are from. And they grows a kind of empathy and an understanding for each other. In 1993, we hosted an entire group of young people so that we could draw up the South African Children's Charter. And during this time, South Africa only had 4 provinces, and we were responsible for the province of the Transvaal, where we also brought children who were so-called street children to come into the conversation as we drew up the charter. And I remember very clearly that some of the young people said to us, how can you call somebody a street child? Every child deserves a home. And we know that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child says that every child deserves a home. Every child needs to have a name. Every child should have food. So when we think about children from the South, in particular from South Africa, children from Africa, there are lots of constraints around ensuring that children have these rights, the very basic human rights. So our work as the Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, having started in around 1996, continues until today. This past few days, we've been hosting the Nelson Mandela Children's Film Festival, which we started in 2018. And the idea of the Nelson Mandela Children's Film Festival was so that we could celebrate Tata Madiba. We call him Tata Madiba as the nation's father, but also the father of all the children of South Africa. And in celebrating Tata Madiba, we wanted to make sure that children were involved in the production of their own content. And we hosted several workshops on animation. And I would like to, at this point, show some of the animation that was based on Wazi. And Wazi was really this 8-year-old girl child who tumbled out of bed. And as she went to discover the continent of Africa, COVID had started. And she was basically told to stay at home. In this animation, and they eventually became several, about 30 one-minuters that we produced, we wanted to talk to children, particularly African children, about COVID. We knew that most broadcasters and most content producers were not really considering children. But we also wanted the content to look like African children so that they could identify with little Wazi and they could understand what this big thing about COVID was all about. We would like to show you a few of those animations right here.
Rise and shine, ilanga libalele. Rise and shine, lijaji lisabi ile.
Wazi and I went back to school today. We were so excited to see each other, but we had to stay apart. We had to practice social distancing. That means at the entrance to school, we had to wait on the lines that were drawn on the ground. So we could not be next to each other. First, we had to sanitize our hands at the gate. We also had to have our temperature checked. Then we could go through the gate to our classroom, and we had to keep our masks on all day. We were very happy to be at school, even if it is a different and new way of being in school. We love school, and we love to be with each other.
Rise and shine, ilanga libalele. Rise and shine, lijaji lisabi ile.
Hello everyone. Before I go to my desk, I have to make sure that my wheelchair is cleaned. I will have to ask for assistance. Then I must wash my hands. I can sing a song for 20 seconds, like Happy birthday to me, happy birthday to me, happy birthday to me, happy birthday to me. wipe my desk. Now I can start with my school lesson today. I can take out my school book. It is so difficult to be sitting so far from Wazi. But we have to practice social distancing so that we don't spread the virus. I will also wear my mask all day until I get back home.
I hope that you enjoyed watching the animations, and I'd like you to know that it was really important for us when we produced these animations with a young team called the African Animation Studio in Popeye. We had them research in terms of the images, in terms of the shapes, in terms of the faces, in terms of the coloring, that indeed all of the imaging would represent African children. And during this time, we also, because it was COVID, we couldn't actually go into studio. We had the opportunity of having some of the animations produced within the home of one of the animators. So in fact, his wife and son became the lead stories. They were actually our subject, and they were the ones who assisted us in terms of the voice and also with the storytelling. So I'd have you watch another one or two of the Wazi animations now.
Hey Musa! Musa!
What?
Let's play a game.
What game?
The countries game.
Okay.
Do you know what continent we are on?
Africa.
Yes, that's right. We're in Africa. Now let's explore some of the countries that are in our beautiful continent. Do you know what country this one is?
Mozambique.
Good job! Can you guess where I am now?
Angola.
Yes! Can you see where I am now?
Algeria.
Yes! Do you know where we are right now?
We are in South Africa.
Sure, Musa, you sure know your countries. I hope you had fun learning with us today. See you later, friends.
The island.
They forgot to put?
This, the island.
Oh,
Like this.
okay. Do you know the name of this island? Madagascar.
Madagascar.
So Little Musa became very popular because the animations were shown globally, and we were very excited that many of the producers in other countries, particularly on the continent, but also in Asia, had said to us that it resonated for their children. Children were really excited to be able to see content from South Africa, but also to see images that they had not seen before. Most animations, as you know, come out of Asia. So the way in which the characters are drawn and the coloring of the characters are specific to Asia, particularly to China. So now to have imaging that came out of Africa was really very exciting. And as I say this, I also want to draw our attention to Netflix. Netflix has just completed a series of African folktales that are animated stories coming out of Africa. So there has been an interest to ensure that we begin to see African children on mainstream media, and particularly on Netflix in the streaming line. For us, the big concern as South Africa is that we do not produce content, unfortunately, feature films for children. So we get very few of them. And as we were working on the Nelson Mandela Children's Film Festival, we found that we had to go out and look more kind of south-south. We are excited that, Brazil, as a country where you sit, have always considered the diversity of people. And so we do find that there's strong images that come out of Brazil, but especially out of the Scandinavian countries, which is really very interesting for us because the Scandinavians have always put children in the center. They have managed to secure resources. They have a very good model, particularly the Danish, where they use a budget out of the ticket sales of films and movies, and they use that money to make sure that they produce quality films for children. So we sometimes find ourselves having to look towards the Scandinavian countries, towards the Dutch broadcasters for content that we can show in South Africa, especially at the Nelson Mandela Children's Film Festival. And these films, because the countries in Scandinavia have been, in some areas, in some cases, they have refugee children, they've also managed to spend time in the storytelling. So you will find children that come from Somalia, Sudan, for example, and these stories have been highlighted through the broadcasters, allowing their children, their local children, to have a better understanding of what the life is for the children who have now come to live in their countries as refugees. I think sometimes it's actually quite interesting and almost funny, particularly when you think of Africa and you know that these countries that we come from are usually hot. We don't have snow. Our children are, outside in the playgrounds. Many of the times they don't wear shoes, as opposed to children who are in the Scandinavian countries where there is snow, where they have to be huddled together in a classroom, and where they dress differently. Through all of this, we are able to show children the diversity globally of how children live in different parts of the world. A few years ago, we produced a series called African Pen Pals. They were 10 short films, just like a pen pal, where you write a story to your friend in another city or in another country. And through the pen pals, we were able to share with the rest of the world the lives of children in South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, and Tanzania. And when I showed these films, particularly to children in the US, they were quite shocked because their understanding of Africa is still very much, as if we don't have proper housing, as if our children are inundated with wild animals. And this has to do really with the way that people are producing content for young people. So you assume that there are not cities in Africa, and you assume that everybody's living on this large landscape and that maybe they have wild animals as pets. So when we produced the series, the African Pen Pal series, we also created an educational pack to go with it so that the parents could talk to their children about what it looks like to live in Africa. And also to give children an impression of not only the dark images that they get from media in terms of poverty and war and HIV and AIDS, but to see ordinary children celebrating extraordinary lives. And at this point, I just want to mention a Nigerian writer, Adichie, who actually says we must be careful of the single narrative, the single story, where you assume that because people are from a particular part of the world, that they only have war, or they only have disease, or they only suffer. And you don't really see them as children that are fully rounded, that they are children who go to school, that they are children who have the joys and the ups and the downs of other children. And with the series, we found that children were really surprised, particularly from Europe and Western countries, when they looked at our kids and they were like, oh my goodness, they go to school like we do. They play games like we do. They have fun like we do. And I think what we as responsible media professionals, our responsibility is to ensure that we do not have the single narrative, that we give children the opportunity to see each other in the multifaceted worlds that we all come from. So we see each other globally, we see each other locally, we celebrate each other. We celebrate our highs and our lows, but we also celebrate the diversity of who we are. Part of our history in South Africa, as we enter our 30 years of democracy, has to do with celebrating diversity. We've had to ensure that all races in South Africa enjoy whatever the fruits of the country. So education, which has always been divided along the lines of race, where white South Africans were allowed and given better education than Black South Africans. We've now had to ensure that in many ways the education is equal, that all children have a right, as we said earlier, to a name, a right to a home, a right to quality education. And as we continue to do this as the Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, we find ourselves in this new era of producing content given the conditions of AI, artificial intelligence, and the fact that voices and sounds can be replicated. It gives us an opportunity both in terms of a positive one, where we could in many ways allow our children to have many diverse experiences. But I think in some cases, we will also find that through AI, we are going to be able to create worlds that might not be representative of the children that we come from. And that we are going to have to be much more clear and much more layered and much more concerned about how AI implicates the lives of our children. How do we make sure that using these digital formats, that the children are able to still share their realities and still share their voices? Because I think this is the most important thing as we work in the sector, is to ensure that the quality media that all our children should be having comes locally, comes from their communities, come from their milieu, so that when they celebrate who they are, we together globally can celebrate those stories, but that we can hear them, the very special sounds that come from our different languages, that come from our different cultures. Because the world, and we knew about this, I think, during the Third World Summit in 2001, when we spoke about globalization, and we wondered how that would impact our lives. I think the concern is that we're not having the special ingredients of who we are as South Africans, of who you are as Brazilians. What is it that makes us unique? Because in our diversity, we also want to celebrate our uniqueness. And we want our children to know that. We want them to know that they're not just one big blob all put together, but that they are indeed special, that they are unique, that their stories are important, that the way in which they talk to us, the way in which they share who they are, the way in which we engage with them has to be special, has to be uniquely for them, and not just for a general global audience. I think for us as the Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, as we celebrated right now the Nelson Mandela Children's Film Festival, we realized that the partnerships we have with the Nelson Mandela Children's Hospital, for example, where we are running workshops in communities with hospitals, with children who are in many cases very, very ill and will probably spend a lot of time in the hospital. We're trying to give them an opportunity to share their unique stories. This is really important. And through the Nelson Mandela Children's Film Festival for 2023, we brought a film that came out of Jordan, but has a special interest on the story of Palestine and the story of the Nakba, which is called The Catastrophe. And having taken this film to different communities in South Africa, it resonated with many of us. I was a young student activist as a matric student, my final year of high school. I was 17 years old when I was detained and imprisoned and locked up in solitary confinement. And when I saw this 14-year-old girl child, Palestinian girl, who is a coming of age story as she's been locked up in a barn because her father is afraid that she might get stolen, might get raped, might get killed during the Nakba. Her trauma of that space reminded me so much of my own trauma as a student activist. And so taking this film into communities in South Africa reminded many of the young people the struggles that we've all come from and the reason why we need to celebrate our freedom. And so we're really excited to ensure that the next 30 years, all children in South Africa will be free, will have equity, will be able to share their storytelling in the most appropriate way, whether it is through animation, live action, new digital ways in which stories will be told, but that together we will celebrate the voices of all children, and particularly Black African children, so that we will continue to see their images in the media that would be mediated by them. The stories will come from their point of view, and it will be a celebration of who they are as young people. Thank you.